All right, it's now 11:08, and at this time we call our Human and Social Needs Committee meeting to order. Can we get a motion to approve the minutes from the last meeting? Can we get a second? It's been properly motioned and seconded. We approve the minutes from the last meeting. All in favor, vote aye. All opposed, the same sign. I want to make sure we're up. Okay, I see we're up now. All right, so once again, we want to thank you for coming out for our Human and Social Needs Committee meeting, and we're going to go ahead and turn it over to Nadia so we can get started. Is your mic on?
That would help.
There we go.
All right. Good afternoon, Mike Kaprowski. Thanks for the opportunity to address the committee. Excited to be here. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to show you the focus of our work at Opportunity Dallas. We're a new nonprofit that looks at economic mobility. How do you help people climb up the income ladder? So today I want to put a spotlight on segregation because I think it's the single biggest barrier to economic mobility. It's a tough issue to talk about. There's lots of pains and scars, but we're always talking about poverty, but you absolutely can't talk poverty without talking segregation. Next slide. So in terms of poverty, can we hit the next slide, please? There we go. We know we got a big problem on our hands, right? Dallas's poverty is frankly obscene. It's abnormally high compared to other major cities. We got plenty of maps, reports, commissions, commentary that identify the problem, express outrage, but we can't fully tackle our poverty problem until we seriously tackle structural segregation, and segregation in two areas, housing and schools. And I think that's at the root of our poverty problem, and try as we might, we cannot program our way out of this one. You know, we frequently talk about programs, right? Food banks and free clinics and job training and after-school engagement, financial coaching, and great programs are needed, no doubt. But programs are tactical. We also need to address the underlying structural issue of segregation if we want dramatic improvement at population scale. And until we address this issue, I fear that we are tinkering along the margins. Next slide. Our housing segregation is startling, and it's economic and it's racial segregation. And let me show a few maps to make the case. I want to thank Commit for helping me put these together. We often talk about how 1 in 3 Dallas kids are living in poverty. That's bad. But here's what makes it so much worse. Poor children are not scattered across the city. They aren't living in diverse mixed-income communities. They are isolated with other poor families. We know that when poverty is dispersed, outcomes aren't as bad. When it's concentrated, outcomes get much worse. And here's what we overlook in our poverty stats. Half of the city's census tracts are home to 90% of children in poverty. So almost all of the poor children in Dallas are found in only half the city's census tracts. Put it another way, half of the city houses almost all of the poor children in Dallas. That is shocking to think about. So instead of dispersing poverty, which we know actually helps children climb out of poverty, we have concentrated poor children in certain parts of town. Next slide. Housing segregation is a poverty trap. It spatially isolates families from critical assets and resources, transportation, institutions, employment opportunities, social networks. Segregation isn't the only cause of poverty, but it's a big one. Your housing situation shapes every aspect of your life, the quality of the school you attend, your access to amenities, resources, grocery stores, banks, pharmacies, recreation, quality health care, who your friends and peers are, the education, income levels of your neighbors, the crime levels of your neighborhood, where you work, where you play, where you worship, your social and professional networks. That's why, in my mind, housing segregation is the issue. Next slide. We are magnetically segregated by race. The map on the left shows all of the census tracts in the city that have a majority of one race. So if it's shaded red, that means it's a neighborhood where one race is 50% or greater. So we talk about the diversity of Dallas as a whole, but we do not live diversely. Dallas as a whole is 41% Hispanic, 32% white, and 23% black. So there's no majority race in our city. But the vast majority of our neighborhoods have a majority race, and in many cases it's a heavy majority race. And in the map on the right, it shows where the races live. They fit together almost like separate puzzle pieces. Whites in orange are the majority race in the north, blacks in light blue, the majority race in the south, and Hispanics in the darker blue are the majority race along the outskirts of the city. Next slide. Housing segregation then leads to school segregation. Most kids go to school based on their zip code. We draw attendance boundaries around segregated neighborhoods, and bam, we have segregated schools. In the city of Dallas, we have found that only 4% of all the schools could be considered socioeconomically and racially diverse. And based on many analyses, we're about as segregated today as we were in the late 60s. There's no laws that say black and white, but it's now attendance boundaries and it's housing patterns. That's the modern form of school segregation. We've known for 60 years that segregating low-income kids in certain schools hurts outcomes. It intensifies achievement gaps, but we continue to do it anyway. Children of color are much more likely than white children to attend majority low-income schools. Affluent kids are enrolled in private schools or selective entry DISD magnet schools or in neighborhood schools that serve wealthy attendance zones like Lakewood. Next slide. None of this happened by accident. Some people say that segregation is due to just individual choices or people just sort of like to live with their own kind. But to say that requires historical amnesia. Segregation was carefully engineered by government. There was redlining of black neighborhoods, zoning rules that classified white neighborhoods as residential and black neighborhoods as industrial. There were rules that prohibited the resale of a white house to a black family. Black veterans in the South were systematically left out of the World War II GI Bill, which offered generous home loans. The Federal Housing Administration, for a number of years, had a racial ranking scale that labeled minorities as the least desirable residents. So this was engineered. This isn't something that we solved in the 60s. It's always been ground zero in the fight against inequity. Next slide. So segregation is economically costly. So even if the moral and the social justice stuff doesn't get you worked up, the economic stuff should. And my sense is that if more people knew how they were impacted in their pocketbooks, would they be more compelled to do something about it? And there's an earth-shattering report out of Chicago that shows how segregation costs everyone, even those in the wealthiest parts of the city. And here's why the Chicago study is relevant to Dallas. The chart on the right shows a metro area's RISI score, Residential Income Segregation Index. According to this, Dallas is even more segregated than Chicago, so the effects that I'm going to talk about are likely to be found in Dallas as well. Next slide. So here's what researchers found, that if Chicago could reduce its segregation just to the national average, so not solve segregation, just bring it down to the national average, incomes for African Americans would rise by $3,000 per person per year, which would increase the earnings of the region by $4.4 billion. Their GDP would increase by approximately $8 billion. That's great for everybody. 30% drop in the homicide rate, which would save $65 million in policing and $218 million in corrections costs. That's less strain on the taxpayer. Real estate values would increase by $6 billion, which means more revenue for local government. More balanced property tax base, which lowers the burden on the wealthy. 83,000 more adults would complete a bachelor's degree, which increases the workforce pipeline for corporations. So none of us are benefiting from segregation. All of us are losing from it. Next slide. Reducing segregation is about economic mobility. It's about climbing up the income ladder from generation to generation. That's the American dream. But here's the reality. The American dream is fading in our country. The graph there shows the percent of kids who earn more than their parents by the year they were born. And it's a dramatic decline. There's lots of reasons for this based on how our economy has changed. But the research shows that segregation remains one of the biggest barriers to upward mobility. And to quote Harvard economist Nathaniel Hedren, who's a leader in this area, he said, quote, "We see that in places where kids of different economic backgrounds are mixing in the same environments, those tend to be places where kids from low-income backgrounds rise up further in the income distribution." He's talking about economic integration. He's talking about mixed income communities. That's what works to create upward mobility. And Dallas lags behind nationally, largely due to our high levels of segregation. So for example, there was some recent research that looked at economic mobility in Dallas. A Dallas kid that grows up in the bottom fifth of income has about a 6% chance of moving to the top fifth of income as an adult. And I'd argue this is largely due to the fact that those in the bottom fifth of income tend to be isolated with others who are also in the bottom fifth of income, and that's disproportionately people of color. So we spend a lot of time talking about fixing poverty, but if we're really going to do that, we have to reduce segregation. Next slide. Another stat, I just want to give you state and national context here. Don't get too caught up on the precise number, it's a little dated, but our levels of concentrated poverty are roughly double the state average and triple the national average. So yeah, every city has these issues, but ours are particularly severe. And when poor families are clustered, you lose that consumer base. And that's when you can't support the amenities and the opportunity. Banks leave, pharmacies leave, grocery stores, et cetera. Next slide. So here's the fundamental question, right? Can we stay this separated and achieve the kind of equity we all say we want? We've resigned ourselves to the idea that the wealthy will have their own neighborhoods and schools, and the poor will have their own neighborhoods and schools. Do we believe that we can be separate and equal? Is there any place in America that has scaled separate and equal results? This is a bigger existential question about the kind of city we want to be. And I would argue, as the court argued in Brown versus Board, that separation is inherently unequal. The question is, how do we move forward? And it seems really entrenched, right? But there are actually realistic and feasible best practices. We can't simply program our way out of this. We have a lot of great programs, but we need a systems-level response. So I would offer three big strategies: comprehensive housing policy, creative school enrollment policies, and raising public awareness to support these policies. And I'll hit each one really briefly. Next slide. So first, I think the most important thing we can do to reduce concentrated poverty and segregation is to adopt a comprehensive housing policy, which we've never really had. And it promotes mixed income and affordable housing throughout the city for people from all income backgrounds. And I know this isn't the housing committee, but housing is a huge human and social need. And we've published our recommendations from Opportunity Dallas for such a policy. We've been talking about it, but this was our attempt to articulate what that could actually look like in Dallas. What are its key ingredients? So this document that you see up on the screen, if you can go back, 25 policy recommendations in there. It builds upon and it gives credit to all the local organizations that have issued recommendations in the past, including the Housing Committee back in August 2016. So this is a working document. We have a task force that's working through it and refining it, and you can access it on our website. Next slide. So I mentioned our task force. So Opportunity Dallas, we are a backbone organization. We try to bring stakeholders together. And so we've brought together a diverse range of over 30 volunteers, real estate developers, fair housing advocates, university experts, education advocates, nonprofits, community stakeholders, association reps, urban planners. Some of them came today. And we came together and we said, can we articulate a set of core values and guiding principles which should shape our housing policy? We set out to answer some really fundamental questions that, quite frankly, our city has avoided for a long time. Like, do we believe people of different incomes should live together? Do we believe that low-income families should be able to access wealthier areas? Do we believe that long-time residents in gentrifying communities should have options to stay if they choose? These are values questions, but if we can't get the values right, we can't get the policy right. And so after a lot of crucial conversations, our task force crafted answers to these questions. We'll give you copies of the resolution afterwards if you'd like them. But we've spelled all these answers out in what we're calling the Dallas Housing Policy Resolution. We spent about 2 months meeting every 2 weeks, really sort of arm wrestling over the exact language that we were going to use. And so we're pretty proud of it. This is something that's unique in the Dallas housing space. It's a broad, diverse community response. It's a big deal. The housing space has not always been as collaborative, I think, as it should be. And so this is a big milestone going forward to get all these perspectives signed on to a set of shared values. There's 35 signatories on it. Now, their signature on there isn't an endorsement of everything I'm saying today. It's simply an endorsement of what's actually in the resolution and nothing more. So I wanted to clear that up. But I think the resolution is a big deal. Next slide. So the last thing I'm going to say about housing policy, this is why I harp on it so much. I want to share the research that shows how powerful mixed income housing can be and why I think it's so critical. There's a study by Raj Chetty, who I mentioned earlier. It was a groundbreaking study in 2015. It created a lot of news. But it was a randomized housing voucher experiment that looked at what happens when a poor child moves to a lower poverty neighborhood before age 13, as opposed to living in a neighborhood of concentrated poverty. And here's what they found. They were more likely to attend college. They were more likely to get married and have kids with a father present. They earned 31% more in annual income, which increased their expected lifetime earnings by about $300,000. They were more likely to live in better, lower poverty neighborhoods as adults. They paid more to Uncle Sam in terms of federal income tax. They were less likely to be on government expenditure and welfare later on. And there was the generational impact, right? That kids and grandkids were more likely to be raised in better neighborhoods by two parents who are more likely to be educated and have higher incomes. That is what breaks the cycle of generational poverty. And they also found an exposure effect, that the more years you were exposed to essentially a mixed income neighborhood, the better all these outcomes were. So housing policy can reduce long-term poverty. And I don't know of many interventions that produce outcomes at this scale and scope. So if you have more balanced mixed income neighborhoods, you can really do something about reducing the persistence of generational poverty. And by the way, you can generate positive taxpayer return. Next slide. So that's housing. Strategy 2. We got to rethink the way we're doing school enrollment. And this captures some of the work that I did at DISD. But basically, attendance boundaries are gerrymandered along neighborhood lines. I saw a report a few weeks ago that school attendance boundaries are more gerrymandered than congressional districts. So that'll give you a sense of the problem. So the way we gerrymander attendance boundaries cements segregation in our schools. There's nothing that says that school districts have to do it this way. So I think school districts have to get more creative in terms of enrollment approaches to increase diversity. There's about 100 districts nationally that are using these approaches. You can do it by rethinking the way we draw attendance boundaries, by using more open enrollment district-wide procedures and rethinking the way we do magnet admissions. And I can get more into specifics during questions if you'd like. And then the last strategy is raising public awareness. And this is the last piece, and I also think probably the most interesting piece of the presentation. We got to raise public awareness about the structural inequities which are built into our system. Because if we don't understand it as a city, we're never going to mobilize the will to do something about it. I think one way to raise awareness is through what we're calling the opportunity index. We all know, everybody knows, that opportunity varies significantly by neighborhood, right? That's not a surprise to anybody. But what is surprising is that we don't have great ways to capture these differences, to measure them, and to characterize them. So I think what we're using today is a little bit insufficient. So right now, how we define high opportunity area, it's basically based on two measures, right? It's the poverty rate and it's whether the school met standard. I think we can more adequately capture the complexities of our neighborhoods. We've got to look at more than just two indicators. So we need a better way to talk about opportunity. And again, I want to thank the folks at Commit for helping me build this out, Robert Mundinger and Zach Ostertag and Maria Pell. They did a lot of the heavy lifting on the data. So let's get into this real quick. Next slide. So here's how it works. Every census tract in the city gets a score based on 14 indicators that are in 4 buckets. So first, economics. Are many in the neighborhood employed, and are they earning a living wage? So we looked at indicators like median income, the poverty rate, and the unemployment rate. 2, education. How many neighbors have completed college, and are the neighborhood's public schools actually growing student achievement? So we looked at the percent with a bachelor's degree, and we looked at school performance data. 3rd, environment. Is the neighborhood safe? Are properties in good physical condition? So we looked at violent crime incidents, and we looked at DCAD property condition ratings. And 4th, access. Are jobs, doctors, food, internet easily accessible to residents? So we looked at things like average commute time, the number of jobs in a neighborhood, number of doctor's offices, fresh vegetables, quality restaurants, and the percent of households with Wi-Fi. And so each bucket is evenly weighted. It's not a perfect science. This is actually version 1.0 for us. We're actually not even done with it yet. There's still, I think, lots of room for improvement. But the idea is to get at which neighborhoods offer a family the most opportunity for economic mobility and to identify what neighborhood factors shape this. Next slide. So all of those 14 indicators are put into a formula. And then we ranked all of the census tracts. So the top 25% of tracts we labeled high opportunity areas, the next 25% moderate, next 25% limited, and the bottom 25% are focus areas. There's roughly 79 neighborhoods in each category. On the map, high opportunity is green, moderate is yellow, limited orange, focus red. And then, of course, there's Highland Park, which we left blank, but we all know that that's a green area. Now, this map will not surprise you. We see tons of maps that look just like this. But here's what I think might surprise you. Next slide. Is the extreme nature of the racial inequities once we ran this. And I think it's the most tragic and startling information that I'll share today. The racial inequities are horrifying. 73 out of 79 high opportunity areas are majority white. The remaining 6 have no majority race. So basically, high opportunity area is synonymous with a majority white area. There is not a single high opportunity area that is majority black. There is not a single high opportunity area which is majority Hispanic. Let me repeat that. There is not a single high opportunity area that is majority black or majority Hispanic. 7 out of 10 majority black census tracts are focus areas. That means 70% of majority black tracts are focus areas. And almost 1 out of 2 majority Hispanic tracts are limited opportunity areas. So in Dallas, opportunity is thoroughly racialized. And that's why I believe that segregation is the single most important thing we can do. Next slide. So what we've done is we've tried to profile the features of these neighborhoods. So, in a high opportunity area, what do you see, right? On average, what's the median income? What's the poverty rate? How many jobs? How many restaurants? How many doctors? And so this is for high opportunity areas. We can click through the next couple slides. Next one would be moderate opportunity. Next one would be limited opportunity. And then focus areas. Next slide. So once this is done, we're not done with it yet, but we're going to have a website where people can actually go in and type in their street address, and they can see the kinds of neighborhoods that they live in. And I think it'll be they'll be able to compare their neighborhood to other neighborhoods, and I think that'll be really eye-opening for some people. So let's real quickly compare a high opportunity area to a focus area. And this is what people are going to be able to do when they type in their street address. So let's compare the top 25% to the bottom 25%. So in a high opportunity area, the median income is $75,000 plus. In a focus area, it's less than $35,000. A 0 to 10% poverty rate compared to over 30% poverty rate. Over 50% with a bachelor's degree, less than 10% with a bachelor's degree. A 20-minute average commute time versus an average of over 30-minute commute time. 4,000 to 6,000 jobs in a high opportunity area, less than 1,000 in a focus area. Let me put it more bluntly. You take a kid from a high opportunity area and you put him in a focus area. Do we really think that his chances for success are the same? Do we really think it's purely a matter of hard work? And vice versa. If a kid from a focus area is able to access a high opportunity area, do you think his chances for success would increase? You bet they would. And so hard work matters. Nobody's saying hard work doesn't matter. But where you grow up is a critical determinant of life outcomes. And my goal with this opportunity index is that it will enable everybody, from elected officials to staffers to policymakers to the general public, to be able to compare scores and to understand why and how some communities have more opportunity than others. Next slide. So that's what we're working on at Opportunity Dallas. There's obviously a lot of necessary and important work that we're not touching. There's transportation, there's healthcare. But I genuinely believe that segregation is ground zero in the fight against poverty. That's all I got. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mike, for that presentation. As you're probably aware of, through the 100 Resilient Cities Initiative, Dallas 100 Resilient Cities, we're looking at equity and focusing on equity. And I think a focus on equity is a way that we address historical discrimination and segregation. So this time we're going to hear from some of the other committee members, and I'll come back at the end. Councilman Caraway.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Mike, and
you,
all that have contributed with you in doing this. Let me ask you about the MVA study. When is that, and would that assist you furthering your project and your resource?
Yeah, I might want to defer to staff in case I get it wrong, but my understanding is that the final MVA is like 3 to 4 months down the road.
I hope not.
I hope I got that right. I might not have, but
Nadia?
I think there's like an initial version and then there's a subsequent version.
Right. I do believe that the first report is coming out, if not this month, by early December.
Okay, it won't be next year.
No, sir.
Okay, all right. So, but then now, and thank you, Nadia. So when you get that would further enhance what you have presented to us.
Yeah, I sure hope so. So that framework that I talked about with all the policy recommendations, I think what we should do is start talking about what's the menu of policy options that we should be talking about right now, the universe of policy options that we should have on the table, so that when the MVA does come out and we have more data to kind of guide our path, we've at least kind of laid out what policy options should at least be on the menu. And so I think that we can start to have a policy conversation at the same time that the MVA is being worked on. That would be my advice.
So you're saying that right now we could be interacting with what is being studied that would enhance where you're doing now?
I believe so. I believe there's best practices across the country in terms of what constitutes a really strong housing policy. And so I think what we can be doing right now is curating those best practices and outlining a menu of options that we can all start to talk about and at least have it on the table that, here's the 25 or 30 policy options that really rise to the cream of the crop, and this is what we'll start to talk about now, and then when the MVA comes, we can...
So now, Nadia, are we doing that now? Are we working with him with our discussions and research is currently going? How can that happen so we won't have to wait?
So, Mayor Pro Tem, my current understanding is that the city has not been officially involved. I believe we have had some executive presence in participating in some of the work sessions and discussions. Okay. But I do think there's an opportunity for us to collaborate a little bit closer with Mr. Kaprowski.
And we've been talking with Raquel, and so we've been collaborating through some.
Well, I want to make sure that this is moving. In other words, I don't like to have meetings and presentations and they get stalled and we're standing still. And let me just be kind of transparent on a few things. And Chairman, I'll be as quickly as I can, but I wrote some notes here. Mm-hmm. As we talk about the segregation and you talked about the schools, the slides that you presented are so very, very true as relate to Southern Dallas. I do not want to make this a North and South issue. However, you just showed us factually that in the southern portion of the city, we have fewer restaurants, fewer opportunities, and that is what brings about a lot of the disparity. One thing I will say as we try to talk to figure out how we're going to solve this moving forward, we won't worry about where we've been, but we need to worry about how we can get it solved. It's going to take all of the participation, level minds, level heads, not racial divide, more than how we're going to equalize things. One example I will say, that in Southern Dallas, for example, and let me play with my famous Dallas Cowboys who won yesterday and use them just as an example. When they get off the plane to come to play for the Dallas Cowboys, they take them north toward Valley Ranch and don't bring them south on Lancaster, Martin Luther King, Camp Wisdom, or none of that. Those are the realities that we're going to have to begin with, because there are no examples and opportunities, because those that have the power to change and take advantage of the programs that you're putting together, they need to also see the other side of town. And that is something that has to be said publicly. I don't care who don't like it. It is the truth. If you keep all of the resources on the opposite side of town, it will take a miracle to come over here. Now, as African Americans and Latinos, we too have a responsibility to be receivers of this opportunity, meaning that we have to first make sure that we are providing the necessary things, such as bringing down the crimes and all of the different things, because we can build beautiful things. That if we're not participating as African Americans, and I'm specifically talking to African Americans and Latinos, that when these opportunities come, then we have to take advantage of them. But at the same token, the North has to realize that they have to come in and be willing to allow these types of programs to work, because it has been a disadvantage. If you look out the window right now to the left of the City Hall, you will see nothing but tall buildings. To the right of City Hall, you see nothing but flat land. And that means that it affects us when you look at the slides and you talk about the jobs. Well, of course, there are more jobs over there because there's more opportunity over there versus it is over on the southern side. So I'm going to be supportive, I'm not going to read everything I have on this little napkin, but I want you all to know it's going to take a change of heart for every citizen in this city in order for this program to work. And it's going to take us as African Americans to be better participants, Latinos to be better participants as we make these projects and we put these things on the table. I'm not going to call it just one way and don't call it the other way. I want to call it the way that it will work for the city of Dallas. This is great. I want the MVA to do that project and complete that, because I was told it was going to be done in November and that we would have it in October or November. Now it's December. So I'm going to be pushing to the manager's office to get that done. I'm going to be very supportive, and I'm very appreciative today of the things that you've shown. It was very professionally presented. It was very factual. It was very informational. Now it's up to us to make it work. Thank you, Chairman, for letting me go so long.
Thank you, Councilman Clayton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Mike. I appreciate you coming down. There's several things that you said, some of which I thought were spot on, some of which I thought, here's kind of within Mr. Mark. Here's what I've always liked about you first. I mean, you didn't go to Baylor, but other than that, you still went to a decent school, so I think you have a good head on your shoulders. But y'all probably won more games than we had this year. But what I really like that you're doing, and what I would encourage you to do more, is where you're playing in the space that I think you really understand, which is DISD, as it relates to housing. I thought you made a point that I did not know, about gerrymandering of school districts as much as gerrymandering of our state level. I thought that was a really smart point, and I would really encourage you to look at that, because I think that's one of the biggest things that I think we're missing. So I think that coming into the presentation, and that's something I didn't realize, I think you did a really good job on. Here's what I'll say: I think you missed the mark, and not being mission critical, but just as far as where you see what I see you thinking your organization will end up becoming kind of a think tank for, to your point, kind of, hey, from a 50,000-foot view, here's what best practices look like. Mm-hmm. Where I would really encourage you is, as we're going through this, I always want to make sure that we have no one group have more influence than the other, every group, same thing that you're trying to accomplish. I think what we know is, I think we have a great sense of what the problem is. I think what we lack is a lot of people coming to us and saying, hey, dummies, here's short, medium, long, here's your ideas. And so where I think y'all's value will be, and I thought it was interesting when I saw your resolution. I'm not a big resolution guy, but what I did think was interesting on that is some of the you had a very diverse group of people, including a couple of people who've been in my office advocating to the antithesis of exactly what you're trying to do, and basically saying, yeah, we know we should have more affordable housing, but we don't want to make our folks have to do it, And so if you can get those folks to have a come to Jesus and actually come to the table and do good things, I think that's fantastic. But I would really encourage you, as this MVA comes out, is to focus on a couple core things, because if it's everything, it's impossible, right? And you acknowledge that too. It's like, we know what the problem is, but we're always looking for, it's like, okay, tell me what best practice looks like. And I know we have staff to do that, but we're always open to good ideas. And so I would encourage you to do that. And I would really encourage you, I think where your ultimate niche could be, is linking DISD's role into our impoverished areas, because there's a lot of people sort of kind of dancing on that line, but nobody's really saying, hey, I've been on both sides of this. Here's what I think you guys should do. Mm-hmm. Here's what the city's role, here's how we can support up to staff to say, hey, have you ever thought about it that way? Because we're still coming from our frame of reference too. But otherwise, I thought it was a really good presentation, and I just wanted to highlight that point that you made about the gerrymandering, because that was something I did not know coming into this conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate that, sir. Thanks. And I think, I don't know if I said this or not, but one of the goals is that those same folks that signed off on the resolution, we're actually meeting tomorrow, and we're going to start talking about specific policy recommendations and not just the range of it. So what we put together was a big honking document that has 25 recommendations in there, but I think where we want to go is let's sequence this out. What's kind of early win, low-hanging fruit, and can we sequence policy recommendations? So I think you're right. A resolution is certainly not enough, but we're going to try to bring those same folks together and come back with specifics in a sequenced way, and hopefully that can help accelerate the conversation as well.
Thank you, Mark. Councilman Magoo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, Mike, appreciate all your work on this.
Thank you.
You bring some clarity in a lot of areas, and I always appreciate that. So I guess just starting looking at that map that's up there, and we can go through this. I'm going to have a little bit of time of just looking through my personal lens of District 10, because as I see the furthest northeast quadrant of this, yes, it's in northern Dallas, but as you see it, it's sort of like a smorgasbord of everything, right? So even the fact that we're talking about strategic integration in 2017 blows our mind a little bit, but that's what we're doing, right? I mean, we're figuring out how to do this. And, as I go through every one of these maps, slide 3, we have the same thing happening where we had some of the lower poverty rates in some of those areas that are doing pretty good, and then it's basically infiltrating with all the higher poverty indicators. And you move further down, I was interested to see, and I want to thank you for pulling in RASD in your research, and that has been an ask from mine for a while. And, you look at the schools, and, it looks like RASD is doing at least better with 9 diverse schools. Yep. And I want to pause there before I keep talking and just get some of your feedback on how that's looking as far as in the grand scope of everything else with the city. How does that play, or what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think that I'm not as familiar as how RISD does the enrollment procedures, but my sense is that the neighborhoods are inherently more diverse and economically diverse, and so therefore you would expect to have more economically diverse schools. There might be, I think it's worth looking at, though I'm not as familiar, as whether RISD does anything creative in terms of its enrollment approaches, or is it just sort of strict, you go to school based on where your attendance boundary is. So I think having a diverse neighborhood is important. It doesn't necessarily guarantee a diverse school. And that's where the school performance really comes in as well. Are the schools offering attractive programs so that affluent families will actually opt into the school? And so that's another piece to look at. So I'll have to do more digging in terms of how our RSD does the enrollment procedures, but we know that the neighborhoods are certainly more diverse than what you would find closer to the urban core.
Yeah, so same kind of thing. I'm looking at really slide 20, and then the way you kind of bridged them together with 21, the high opportunity areas, and 22, the middle and limited opportunity, and the focus group. And again, looking through my lens up in that northeast quadrant, we've got it all.
Yeah.
So it seems like we're still divided on census tracts, because it looks like that's the number you're going in. But we're also more diverse than, as you would say, citywide, and trying to be not the model, because we're not there yet. Yeah. But am I reading this right? I
think so. It's closer, but I think what you really want to get to at the end of the day is having diversity within the tract itself. Exactly. You don't want a census tract that's like high opportunity, and then the adjacent census tract is a focus area. That would imply that there's really actually stark segregation within a relatively small geographic area. So I think what you're wanting to see is diverse high opportunity areas. That's what we should be shooting for. And right now, if you were lucky enough to be able to afford a high opportunity area, which, it's getting prohibitively expensive in Dallas to move into a high opportunity area. So if you're lucky enough to afford a high opportunity area, and you were specifically looking for a diverse high opportunity area, you would have 6 census tracts to choose from, right? Because 73 out of 79 high opportunity areas are majority white. and heavy majority white. So we want diverse, high opportunity areas. We don't want just sort of census tracts all in the same general region that are diverse. You want diversity within the census tract, because census tracts are still, 5,000 people in a census tract, something like that. So they're still pretty big areas.
Yeah. Well, that's the exact point I was trying to get to. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
What policies, what impacts do we have for bridging those stark differences that are, it's all there, but it's one street over,
Yeah.
and it's what.
Yeah, I think it really comes down to the housing policy piece and just the range of it. So whether it's voluntary inclusionary zoning or whether it's accessory dwelling units, all those sorts of policy apparatus.
I hear, but even at there, and now we can talk offline on some of this, but we're built out, right? So it's multifamily, high dense, single family, and those are the lines that are drawn,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what's there. And so this being the struggle.
Yep.
Just.
Yeah, it's certainly hard once the lines are drawn, but there's things you can do. I mean, as new development takes place, you could potentially consider a certain set aside to be affordable in a higher opportunity part of town. So there's constantly development happening, and as new development happens, there's certain incentives that the city can provide to include affordable set asides there. There's also, when redevelopment is happening in the focus areas, there's more of a mixed income approach that can happen there. So I think that those are. There's also the zoning piece as well. That one of the reasons that we have such stark segregation is the way that we have zoned the land, right? When you have a swath of an area that's single-family zoned and then a swath of an area that's multifamily zoned, it sort of cements economic segregation right then and there, because certain families can afford the multifamily and certain families can afford the single-family large house with large setbacks and all that kind of stuff. So we can also think about the way how we can break down exclusionary zoning, and it might be things like garage apartments, it might be things like backyard apartments to give people rental opportunities in a single-family district. And so I think that there's creative options that you can look at there, but there are ways to do it. And again, this isn't something that you can do overnight. It's having a policy infrastructure in place so that as these neighborhoods are changing, you can start to correct what has been done over the past 100 years. But you can't do it overnight.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your work on it. We'll have lots more discussions, but thank you for bringing this up.
Thank you, Councilman Magoo. Councilman Darvis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to first thank you for this. Some of it was eye-opening as I went through it and looked at it, especially the school portion. And I know this entity, we don't have a lot to do with schools because it's not our jurisdiction. However, as council members, we're the first line. The people come running to us when their schools are failing, when something's going on. And right before I took office and through now, I've been dealing with an education crisis in West Dallas. And DISD has decided to continuously close schools, shift kids around. Now we're getting ready, an idea has come out to close the only middle school in West Dallas. We have one middle school, and now they want to close it and ship our kids to a completely different neighborhood. So as I hear this, it's like I understand what you're saying, but at the same time, it's like now we want to send these kids completely to a completely different neighborhood, where they're not going to be comfortable and they're not going to be ready. And it's hard because how do we get DISD to no longer continue this system of systemic racism for West Dallas, which has been going on, for decades and decades and decades. And so we have black and brown kids that have not been given a high quality education as they deserve. And it's one of those things, just like what you said with the segregation of the lines for where kids go to school. Well, we have it the same way with our trustees. And, I in my district, District 6, I literally have a majority of the board overlap through District 6 at one portion or the other. In Northwest Dallas, I see where the opportunity changes. And I have black and brown kids that live in these areas and families, and their schools are better, exactly what you're saying. They live in a not so segregated part of town where they're getting the higher quality education in these different elementary schools because they are going to school with kids that are from different economic backgrounds. Growing up in Houston, elementary from kindergarten through senior year of high school. I went to 3 schools, 1 elementary, 1 middle, and 1 high school. And exactly what you were talking about really made me think about myself. And we weren't the richest family in the planet. We were, today's standards, we would be considered poor. I didn't know that growing up. But I went to school with kids that were the wealthiest of kids, all public school. Yeah. And that, as I look back, was really what afforded me opportunities, because I had different families that I was meeting with, getting to go play with, hang out with, right. Go to different events with through the school, which made me know that there were different opportunities out there. The next one is transportation. I know you could only do so much. I mean, this could have taken you decades to put all together, and you want to get something going. Housing policy, definitely, we got to get on that. The city of Dallas, we don't have one. And so staff doesn't really know that every project is, what do we do? How do we do it? And the last one is transportation, is the same thing. DART is failing us, especially in our lower socioeconomic areas, because they don't feel safe at stations. They don't have an ability to get there. When they're standing there at the bus stop, they're getting rained on. They're standing in mud. And it's the last thing I want to do if I'm a senior citizen or I'm, a 10-year-old kid with my parents, getting on the bus to go somewhere to get to where they can go. And this is something that I, we're about to be. My opinion is we're in a crisis already, and this crisis can really get to where we can't come back if we're not careful. So I want to thank you and your team for putting this together, because I do think that as people start to see it and learn more, I think we're going to be able to start talking more. Yeah. And I think that's the whole point. Let's start talking, have an open and honest debate about these things. And, it's not about you have, we have. It's about how do we get this equity so that all areas are afforded the ability to have the same chance at, the American dream here in Dallas, Texas. So I want to thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Darvis. Councilman Kingston.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Kaprowski, thanks for the presentation. I was very happy to hear you mention zoning. Do you know what percentage of the city's land area is zoned for R75, residential 7,500-foot minimum lot size?
No.
I don't know it off the top of my head either, but it's by far our biggest zoning classification. You will never change that zoning. Don't ask. The neighborhoods would come unglued. So I was also very happy to hear you mention accessory dwelling units and garage apartments. Yep. And I've been looking at Vancouver lately with their laneway housing. So is that a strategy that can afford some mixing of incomes in neighborhoods?
Absolutely. It's a very promising strategy, and it gets around that, right? You start talking about breaking up, R75, you're right, it's dead on arrival, it's a non-starter. But what accessory dwelling units actually provides the opportunity to do is for homeowners, if they want to, a lot of these lots in high opportunity areas are relatively large lots. And so there might be a backyard where you can put in kind of the tiny house or you can put an above garage apartment. And so if we had permissive policies to allow homeowners to do accessory dwelling units, not only does it provide a moderate to lower income family the opportunity to rent in a R75 district that they couldn't otherwise afford, but it also provides that homeowner in an R75 district the opportunity to gain some rental income, which they can then put toward their mortgage or toward their kids' college savings. And so I think accessory dwelling units is a way to break up exclusionary zoning without really touching zoning. I think it's one of the most promising strategies that we should consider right now. And I think that the other big thing is it's relatively low cost for the city. And it's something that we could have in place really quickly. So I think if you look at the universe of policies in here, the low-hanging, early win, low-cost stuff, I think accessory dwelling units rises to the top of the list for me.
And colleagues, we could have it by December. You will see a briefing on this at Housing this month. And if it gets through Housing okay, then it'll be on a council agenda in December. Yep. So I'm very happy to hear. I very much appreciate your group, Mike. The outside advocates that you've included are very welcome in this debate. This council adopted about 40% of comprehensive housing policy, and then that just stalled out. I don't know what's happened to it. You tell us on slide 12 that your recommendation is that we should adopt a comprehensive housing policy. would your recommendation also be similar in terms of a comprehensive economic development policy and a comprehensive transportation policy?
Comprehensive is always better.
Yeah.
No matter what area you're looking at, yeah.
What we've learned in looking at poverty from the process we've gone through is that all of the housing dollars, the federal housing dollars, got spent in the South, and all the economic development dollars got spent in the North. And it's kind of my gut feeling that what we ought to do is just flip that. Is that more or less what your group has talked about?
I think what we're really talking about is a holistic revitalization plan. That one of the dangers that we can get into is if we take a pot of economic development money and divide roughly equally, then there's basically enough money to do scattershot investments. You know, you do Wi-Fi here, you do a sidewalk here, you do a fence here, you do a rec center here. But the research is very clear that particularly for communities that have been in generational poverty for a long time, that it's not enough to fix just one or two aspects of a disadvantaged community. You got to really go all in terms of mixed income housing, in terms of health and wellness, in terms of education. And so I think that my recommendation would be to identify a smaller number of revitalization areas. I think if you count up, Neighbor Up and you count up Grow South, there's a lot of revitalization areas out there. My recommendation would, let's have more of a phased approach where we identify maybe 3 to 4 revitalization areas at a single time and go really deep in terms of staff, energy, and resources and do it holistically. And so that's why I think it's this idea of a holistic revitalization plan.
Does DISD need a housing policy?
Yes. Yes. Now, it wouldn't be as
if
robust
DISD
as the
had
city.
developed workforce housing on its parcels on Ross, would it have revitalized the census tract that contains the failing elementary school J.W. Ray?
I think it could have helped over the long
Yeah,
haul.
I think it might have helped.
And I think that, too, it would improve the enrollment numbers as well. So I think that this is an important point, though, is that it's not just the city's responsibility to try to promote affordable and mixed income housing, that every public agency that owns public land, whether it's DISD or DART, can play a role in accelerating the types of things that we're talking about. So I think, again, this is one of those issues where we can't just sort of stay in our jurisdictional silos. We got to start thinking about how we can all accelerate affordable and mixed income housing.
Let me just mention 2 things that I'd love for you all to consider. One is, I read that story about the gerrymandered attendance zones, and so I went and looked at DISD's attendance zones, and they don't look gerrymandered at all. They look very compact, very geographically defensible. The problem is the segregation that already exists inside that attendance zone. So it doesn't look screwed up, but it is.
Yeah.
The other thing that I would say is I would caution you all not to focus too much on mobility, physical mobility, because one thing that we know is that at least for the remainder of our careers in public service, we are going to have neighborhoods that have been victims of concentrated poverty. So we also need solutions that talk about how do you fix a neighborhood that's in bad shape.
Right.
And I know you won't forget about that, but it's on my mind.
Yeah, I think it's a yes and of where there are opportunities for low-income families to access higher opportunity areas. We need to have that conversation, but we also have to talk about how do we revitalize and transform high-poverty communities into mixed income, because the scale of the concentrated poverty problem is so big that just revitalization has to be a key pillar of the strategy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilman. Thank you, Mike, for the
Thank you.
presentation.
I appreciate
Thank
it.
you for the information, and we look forward to hearing some of your policy recommendations going forward.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Nadia, we're ready for the next brief.
Yes, sir. And as staff are coming forward, just want to clarify my comments on the MVA. The study is being completed and going to the steering committee this week. If there are no comments or changes, it will be made public this week. If there are some comments or changes coming from the steering committee, it could be as late as the end of this month or December when that document will be made public.
Now, okay, who is the steering committee?
So that is being facilitated by our Chief of Economic Development, Raquel Favela. I can get that information to you as to who's on the steering committee.
Will Councilman Atkins be apprised of that?
I believe so, yes, sir. But I will confirm.
Okay, but I want to also, at the same time,
Yes, sir.
be part of that.
All right, I will let Ms. Favela know.
Yeah, and also along those lines, if you would have Raquel at least to send it before it goes public, make sure the council members have an opportunity to look at it.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. All right, we're ready when you are.
Okay, our next item is the